Now, we have some very special people. We have trustees of the college, and it is something to become a trustee. It means that you are, in fact, in a fiduciary responsibility, not just with all those who've gone before and those who are there now, but for generations into the future. You are saying you hold that most precious college in your hands, and I want to recognize our trustees, Hazel Hare, Greg and Dana Schuler, Mark Johnson, and trustee emeritus, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Vitti. Please stand all, please, trustees. Now, I also have to ask, Hillsdale's got a giant. His name is Jared Valdir. Would you stand up, Jared, please? I want people to meet the giant. He is now an Arizona Cardinal. But the better half, Morgan Valdir, is here. Would you stand up, Morgan, the volleyball player? Now, I saw Jared and I gave him a hard time. I am a long-suffering Cleveland Browns fan. I went to every home game from 1965 to 1974. I bought the tickets when they came back after they were ripped out of our city and returned in 1999, and so I've had season tickets from 1999. I asked Jared why he didn't sign with the Browns. He said there's a guy named Joe Thomas. Now, Joe is, in fact, a 7-time Pro Bowler, but we do have a right tackle, Mitch Schwartz, who needs to move inside, Jared, so I'm a little disappointed. But if you'll pledge us your child to the Browns, that's all I care about. All right, good. Dr. Arnn was telling me that Jared is not only a wonderful example of the combination of athletics and scholarship that comes out of Hillsdale, but also of loyalty to the college and has made part of his good fortune the good fortune of Hillsdale. I salute you for that. That's really a remarkable thing, and thank you. My friends at 960 AM The Patriot and at Cambridge Wealth Management helped make this event possible, and thank you to you all for doing so. I love my station here in town. And I want you to know, for the benefit of those of you who are shy, this program is recorded for an audio CD of it afterwards, and Dr. Arnn will say some things that are memorable. You just have to ask a staff member at the registration table. I'll also tell you that at the back, you will be able to find free copies of Dr. Arnn's book, The Founder's Key. You'll also find that this presentation will be online and posted very, very soon. Many college materials are at the back, and they are free. And I would like you to not only take them for yourselves, but for people who ought to be involved in the cause, and I'll be talking about the cause in just a moment. Please spread the word, not just about Dr. Arnn and the Founder's Key and about Hillsdale, but about the fact that people who are concerned about the future of the country can find a real, tangible way to be involved in it. I tell people you've been given 10 fingers to keep track of 10 things. You've got to have in your life a church and a parachurch organization. You've got to have in your life at least two colleges, one of which not your own that you are supporting, and one veterans organization, and at least 5 candidates. And if you do not have something for each one of those fingers, you are not doing your job. One of those fingers, a lot of you helped us. I saw Kathy and Judge Herod earlier, and a lot of you helped us elect Doug Ducey, and you have a terrific governor in the state of Arizona. So that was one of those 5. And you've got great congressmen, and you've got a great budget, and you've got a great future, and I'll be back next week at the Chamber of Commerce to sit down with another great governor, Scott Walker. But I wanted to begin, largely because of Larry Arnn, my profile has been rising a little bit. Every time I see Larry, he says, we've got to make you more famous. I said, that's not hard to do if you start from a position of very low, but Larry works at it very hard, and he goes around. So the last week, I was on Meet the Press, I was on the cover of National Journal, I was profiled in the Huffington Post, and it was announced that I was going to be a questioner at one of the presidential debates. And people asked me, how did that happen? And I very candidly tell them, I believe that happened because Larry Arnn committed 3 years ago to something called the Hillsdale Dialogues. Now, I don't know if you listened to them in the last radio hour of the week. And it's a good rule of thumb that if you hang around smart people, folks will get confused and think you're smart. Even when you ask a lot of dumb questions. And I ask a lot of dumb questions on the Hillsdale Dialogues, but they are all available online. And they are now 100 plus hours of conversation between Dr. Arnn and myself and the colleagues that he has. And they are wonderful colleagues, Paul Ray and Stephen Smith and Tom West. I could name a dozen of them who have come forward, and we began with Homer. And last week we were doing Nietzsche, which was a real happy hour. And everything in between, and now we are going deep into the Constitution. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that tonight. But I view that little aspect of Hillsdale, it's just one of the things that the college does that goes so far beyond the college. For 170 years, it has been what I call the Lantern of the North. And I got that when I was in Scotland a few years ago. I went to Elgin, and Elgin is way north up in Scotland. And in fact, they had a cathedral that they called the Lantern of the North. Sounds pretty good, right? Until they figured out that the Vikings could see it and they came and burned it down. But I like that title of the Lantern of the North because they always kept the fire burning, and mariners could find true north, and they could find Scotland by finding the Lantern of the North until the Vikings actually looted it. Hillsdale, for 170 years, has been the Lantern of the North of America. It is up near our north coast. It has stood for the same thing since before its founding. It has been led by great men. It has been led by great people. And it has always been led by the principle that the American Constitution represents, an extraordinary moment in time and space that is to be replicated and to be honored and to be understood and, if possible, protected. And that's their mission. That's why I'm so in love with the colleges. They keep doing it, and they keep doing it, and they keep doing it. Every single Hillsdale student studies the Constitution. They study Western civilization. They study the American Constitution. They study how it is that we got here. We are all arrived here by 1,000 different stories. And I saw a story the other night in the movie theater called 71. It's the story of Ulster during the Troubles. And it's a terrible, terrible movie. It's absolutely riveting. But you wonder, how is it that that great British Empire was so torn asunder in Ulster that it never happened here? And it happened that we were spared the sectarian violence and that we were spared that disunity because of those genius that gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, and before that, that gathered in Philadelphia in 1776, and another genius who came along in 1860 and restored the electric cord that binds us all. And Dr. Arnn will be talking about that in a little bit. But that is always, as Ronald Reagan said, one generation from being lost. Yesterday, it was this close to being lost in Israel. This close. And it wasn't. And I like to think it wasn't. I'm going to embarrass Arnn a little bit here. In fact, I'd like to embarrass Arnn a lot if I could tonight, but because he does that routinely to me on the radio. Routinely, not a week goes by. But I'm going to embarrass him in a good way. I think Bibi Netanyahu owes his election to Larry Arnn. And I have an argument why. Because 2 weeks ago, a letter was circulated and signed by a young man named Tom Cotton, who was an extraordinary American. And that letter crystallized for this week a key issue as to how the Constitution operates with regards to foreign agreements with dictators. And that letter crystallized a great reaction on the left, and they bared their teeth, they showed their fangs, they were hysterical with anger at Tom Cotton. Now here's something you may not know. Before Larry Arnn came to Hillsdale, he was the president of the Claremont Institute. The Claremont Institute runs a tremendous program called the Publius Fellows. And the Publius Fellows bring out young people, young men and women, 18, 19, 20. And they fill up their head with all these dangerous ideas that occurred around Philadelphia in 1776 and 1787 and 1789. And then they send them off to go back to places like Harvard and Harvard Law School, where Cotton managed to get through without too much damage being done to his understanding of the Constitution. And they prepare them for public life, and they prepare them for service. So Tom Cotton didn't just get out of Harvard Law School and go to work in the big law firm or the DC Circuit or all those other wonderful things he did. He got out and he said, I will go into the military because I understand it's my duty to do so. and I will go provided that you do not make me a lawyer. Now, I have great admiration for lawyers in the military. I know some of them who've served in harm's way, and one of them just got back to the Assistant United States Attorney's Office that he left a year ago, and he was outside the wire every day at Comp Bond Steel. So I got nothing against lawyers. But being a ranger is different from being a lawyer in the military, and Tom Cotton went and he was a ranger. And then he came back, and he sent a letter up to some other Arnn buddies at Powerline, and Powerline made the country aware of Tom Cotton. And Tom Cotton then got the idea that he'd come back to D.C. after he'd done his service as a ranger and he'd run for Congress, and a lot of people scoffed at that. And he talked to Larry Arnn about that. And Larry Arnn said, if you're ready for Congress, go for Congress. A guy named Lincoln tried it. And so he ran, and he won against the odds. And then a couple of years went by, less than 2 years went by, and he took a look at the fact that the country's in trouble, and he said, I'm going to take on a sitting senator who is a legatee senator, meaning his last name is Pryor, and you don't beat Pryors in Arkansas. And he consulted again, and I'll embarrass Larry again. He didn't call me, he didn't call the Powerline guys, he called Larry, and he talked about whether or not that was a good idea to do. And Larry Arnn, I don't know what his advice was. All I know is that he's been consulting with Tom Cotton every step of the way. And Tom Cotton would be one of the first people to say what he's learned about the framing and what went into that letter that stood for first principle of constitutions, are things that he learned from Larry Arnn and from Hillsdale College and from the Publius Fellowship. So tonight in this room, because you support this college, you are directly connected, and I mean directly connected, to the result in Israel yesterday that sent a chilling message to the mullahs of Tehran who would terrorize the world. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for supporting this college. Now, if you are not already receiving Imprimis, where have you been? Now, every week I say Imprimis is free, and I want you to sign up for it. I want you to sign up everybody in your family for it, and I want the message to spread. If everybody does that 3 times, the exponential impact of that, you find 3 people, and they sign up 3 people, and they sign up 3 people, Hillsdale can prosper and grow, and in its mission become absolutely more influential. I'm going to close by turning this over to Larry, and then we're going to talk by telling you about just 2 other senators. One of them is named Ted Cruz, who you may have heard a little bit about as well. Arnn tells me last week he went to an event where Cruz was talking about Hillsdale College and the commencement address that he gave there and the impact it's having on the country. And I don't doubt that for a second, because Ted has always said that to me when he's in California. And a third senator, Mike Lee. Mike Lee called me up last week. I was up at a bastion of wrongheadedness, Stanford, at a little fortress within Stanford of right-headedness, the Hoover Institution, and my phone rang, and it was Mike Lee, and Mike Lee wanted me to do a fundraiser for him. Now, I typically I've only done one fundraiser, because it's a pain in the neck, right? I'll go to him and I'll write checks, but to organize is a pain in the neck. And Mike Lee asked me if I'd do a fundraiser for him, and I said instantly, you betcha, I'll do it. Because you are a friend of Larry Arnn at Hillsdale College, and you go to the Kirby Center, and that means you're serious about your job. So as you sit here tonight, and we're talking about the college and what the college does and the crisis, understand that the crisis is real, but so are the reinforcements. And they're coming out of this room, and they're coming out of Hillsdale College, and they're coming out of the people that you support every day by being a supporter of this. Whether it's Jared, whether it's the trustees, whether it's the parents, whether it's the alum, you built a great thing, and it's something about which you ought to be proud and you ought to tell people. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the president of this institution to talk about a little bit of where we find ourselves, and then I'm going to subject him to rigorous cross-examination. Dr. Larry Arnn.
Thank you. It's always better if that happens before you say anything. Can everybody hear me? It's lately come to sight that I'm a terrible public speaker. And I have a reputation, people tell me, of being pretty good at it, but that's because people can't hear. And so if at any point you can't hear, hold up your hand, and I will mumble. Now, I'm going to, 30 minutes ago, so Hugh Hewitt has been a friend of mine for, it's got to be close to 25 years now, before he was famous. And I do have a purpose, a avowed purpose, to make him more famous. And the reason is, he's not very smart, but he's smarter than most people on the radio. And it's good for the country if he does well. And the thing about dealing with him, and it's 25 years now I've been dealing with him, is you never have the least idea what's about to happen. And so this is like our event right here. You people are all here tonight as the guest of Hillsdale College, which I happen to be I run the dang place. But no, the plan is not what I was told, so I'm to talk to you for a minute, and I didn't know that. And I'm going to do that in a minute, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say, because I'm just going to say a few things. I'm going to make fun of Hugh and explain something about why he's good. I'm going to tell you something about Tom Cotton, something about Netanyahu, and then I'm going to tell you one thing about the state of the republic as it relates to education. And that's all I'm going to do. But before I do that, I want you to know, I'm going to tell you something about Jared Valdier. So Jared and his wife Morgan and his brother Arnn are graduates of Hillsdale College, and that means in the case of Jared, I didn't know him when he was small. He never was. He and his brother are exactly 1 foot different in height. The brother played point guard on the basketball team. Jared played the whole left side of our offensive line. And the main thing in Morgan, who's, I'd say 80% as smart as Jared and Arnn put together. She's great with child, by the way. And they're both smart. They're both very good students. Jared, I think it's not legal. Well, I don't take money from the government. It is legal. Let me tell you about their student records. So Arnn the lawyer was near top of his class, and Jared was, it'd be terrible for me to say his grade point average, but it was 3.4. And at Hillsdale College, that's hard, right? Biology. Said he wanted to be a medical doctor. He'd have to work in a very large hospital. And what I know about him is, I know them all three, and I'm very proud of Jared, but not so much because he's one of the best players in the NFL. I am proud about that. I like football, but I like what he is. He's a very fine young man, and I'm going to ask him to come up and say something to you for just a minute, please.
All right, so I really am getting up here and saying something. All right, excellent. I just want to say thanks to Hillsdale for everything that it's taught me, my family, just, tremendous, virtue and integrity that it instills in you. And I think that's one of the reasons that I've been able to have success in the NFL, just all the things that you learn about Hillsdale. I mean, you can't go to Hillsdale without signing an honor code, and that's something that's pretty unique to Hillsdale. And, when I was there, some people were kind of like, especially the younger students were like, why do we got to sign an honor code to go here? And really, they should ask themselves that question about 10 years down the road after they have their degree and when they're actually out in their profession, because they'll look back and know why they did and know what they're a part of and, the great thing that they did in getting a degree from Hillsdale and what that Hillsdale degree is doing for them. So I just wanted to say thanks for everyone supporting the college. I'm very proud to be an alum, and I'm proud to be married to an alum, maybe have a future alum. I'm not sure. The size of the baby is telling me that it might be tough to convince him to go Division II, but I don't know. Anyway, I want to say thanks to Dr. Arnn, and thanks to Hillsdale College. Thanks for all of you coming out.
Look at that. I am exactly the height of Winston Churchill. So I want to tell you a story about Jared. Jared's sweet. He's a sweet boy, and he's a little nerdy too. And so we had some really big victories when he played football for us, and it was because he would block the entire right side of the defensive line. And we play good sports at our college. We're very good at it. But the weird thing about it is, so in the year that Jared graduated, a boy graduated who graduated from Yale Law School at the top of his class and is a Supreme Court clerk and is one of the most important young lawyers in America today. And that boy is rocket scientist smart, right? Arnn is very smart. And half the time in their college careers, Jared and that boy and every other kid at Hillsdale College were taking the same classes, because half the classes are the same for every kid in the college. And that means Jared has read Herodotus and Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle, and he studied chemistry and physics and biology and math, and he studied the history of Western civilization, as every kid does, right? And every kid at Hillsdale does that. And so when he was at the other place where he used to coach, I used to say in our athletic department that the athletic program at Hillsdale College has been appointed by God to make the Oakland Raiders respectable. I think they were puzzled, like he would look at the signs and he could read them. So thank you, Hugh. For us to live, we have to reach a lot of people. You know, the only person, like when Hugh hosts one of these events, which we try to get him to do every year, he's the only one who ever suggests you ought to give us any money. I don't bring it up. If you want to give us money, you will, and many of you will, at least will. But to get that to happen, because, you know, if you do give money, it'll be because you love the same thing we do, right? And the generosity is your virtue, not mine. And so we have to tell a lot of people what we do to find the 1,000 people who'll come tonight and like what we do and learn about it. That's how the college works. And so we need a way to reach a lot of people. And Hugh is the best single person to do that with, because I'll say it once and never again, he's pretty smart and he's pretty good. I've been corresponding with Tom Cotton this week, and I emailed to him and told him that I liked what he did. My wife and I happen to know his wife very well, and had known him since he was in undergraduate school. And he's a very great man. He's really going to be something. He is something right now. And it's a pattern about him. So he wants to establish that he's a worthy citizen of America in order to present himself to his fellow citizens for public office. His way of doing that is to expose himself to gunfire for months. He's like that. He asked me to lobby the military, I know generals, I know a few, to make sure he didn't get Judge Advocate General. Then he wants to, and see, I looked it up this week and sent it to him. He didn't ask me to, but I thought I would because he's busy. This tradition, there's an old tradition and a modern tradition of bipartisan foreign policy. And the modern tradition of bipartisan foreign policy starts with the relationship between three people, Harry Truman, Dean Acheson, and Arthur Vandenberg, a Republican senator. And they worked out a deal in the aftermath of the Second World War, and this deal gave rise to America's leadership in the world. They did the Marshall Plan, and they did the Truman Doctrine, which saved specifically Greece and Turkey, and saved, therefore, NATO, and saved, therefore, the united effort to oppose the Soviet Union. And those three guys really worked that out together. And the deal that they made, which is very well recorded, it's easy to look up in history. In particular, you can read Dean Acheson's book, President at the Creation. The deal they made was, we have separate jobs, we in the Congress and the executive branch. And we don't have the power to give up those jobs. And we don't have the power to do each other's jobs. But we do need to present a united front. And so here's what we're going to do. And Acheson in particular thought this up, takes pride in the fact that he did in his book. We're going to talk to you all the time about what we do. And we're going to not make any agreement with anybody that we don't discuss with you in advance and then present to you for debate as a formal treaty. And see, by the way, that doesn't just involve the Congress then in the process, that involves every one of us. See, because you learn from Winston Churchill, I have learned from Winston Churchill, that he thought that the activity of debate in the House of Commons is the way we all get to participate and watch what the government does. Because when you debate with the opposition, you have to state your reasons. And then it becomes possible for reason to govern, right? And so the deal they worked out with Vandenberg is, we're going to talk to you in advance, we're going to give you a chance to debate, and we're going to compromise with you. And we're going to get as much of that done as possible before we tell anybody in the outside world. So now, this is the agreement that Tom Cotton is accused of breaking. Did he? Because here's the point. Obama's response from his own lips was, and from his agents who talked to the press, both, was that, of course, the Congress is not going to be able to overturn this because a whole bunch of nations are going to agree to it. In other words, it is his avowed purpose to present the legislative representatives of the American people with a fait accompli. And that is a scorn of separation of powers, which James Madison says is the central protection that we have after the fact that we get to elect them. So the point is, that's something fundamental going on, isn't it? I mean, it's not just, you should go read Tom Cotton's maiden speech given 2 or 3 nights ago. You can find it on C-SPAN. It was a tour de force. It was very powerful. I was privileged to read bits of it while he was writing it. And he actually asked me a question about Winston Churchill, and I answered it. And darned if I didn't get it wrong, and he got it right. I'm annoyed with the boy. But you see, this question of the foreign policy question, of whether it's a good idea, what are we going to do about Iran? What are we going to do if they get nuclear weapons? What if they build a great empire and now there's 3 or 4 and we're one of, let's say, 4 with Russia and China and the Muslim world? What's that world going to be like to live in? That's very serious stuff, right? But it actually is the second most serious stuff. Because the most serious stuff is how we're going to govern ourselves. Is it a fact that we have the right in the laws of nature and of nature's God effectively to consent to the government over us? Is it a fact that those who work in the government are obliged to work hard to make that consent possible to us, to our convenience? You know, there are 3 trustees of the college here tonight, and I ask you, they stood up, you know who they are. Mark Johnson and Greg Schuler and Frank Veit. You can ask them after this. I run the college, and I do run it very much, and I'm a very powerful runner of it. Ask them if I don't make it plain what I'm doing with time for them to make a decision. Because it's my job. It also, by the way, incidentally makes me stronger. Because if I have to fight somebody, and I do sometimes, then I'm able to look at them and say, there's a whole bunch of us you're going to have to quarrel with. And you couldn't even beat me by myself. I have said that to people sometimes. And so that's the times we live in. And my real point that I want to make is just a simple one. Why has this happened? What's going on in the world? So I've learned something teaching in college. I'll say this to all you young ones. The reason I tell you, and I tell you the ones who might come, there are 2 here tonight who are planning to come that I've met. There are probably others. I always say the same thing to them. I say, you have to understand it's hell. It's real cold there, and the town is remote and boring. And we've had 5 people get a 4-point in 25 years. You should really, I said to both of them tonight, I said, you should really think about going somewhere else. And they all, because they're young, right? And I'm this old man talking to them that way. Why do I do that? Because I've learned something from them. I don't teach them, they learn. The things I know, there are 2 things that I know as much about as anybody alive, and there's a third that I have a serious academic knowledge of. And I'm very qualified to teach those things, and I love those things. I've given my life to them. I studied them with the best teachers in the world. Both of them have died in the last few months. I used to think that it was because of those teachers that I know what I know. But then I started teaching myself, and I found that if I tried to do too much for them, they would just yawn. And I've started to form a picture of the human soul from their faces in class. They have the gift to know in them, but they have to struggle to know, just like I did. I made choices to know what I know. I gave myself to it for a long time. Every close friend in the world I've got. Tom Cotton is one. Hugh Hewitt is one. They all love the same things I love. And that means they own it as much as I own it. Now today, when we talk about education, we forget that sacred fact that is apparent in the soul of every human being. And we think that there's an entitlement to education, and we think that we can run the schools better to make people better factors of production. It's dehumanizing. Right now in America, everywhere, all over here, every public school in the land is taking February and March off to cram for a bunch of standardized tests. And they're written by a bunch of bureaucrats who are always inventing something new. Whereas, by the way, Plato's Republic has been a great book for nearly 2,500 years. So something has arisen that makes the people in power want to treat us as tools. And that, and not Iraq, is the crisis of the age. Iran, sorry. And we have to defend ourselves against Iran, and we have to do that urgently, in my opinion. But I will also say that if we fix that problem, that we have abandoned the laws of nature and of nature's God in America, if we fix that problem, Iran and everybody like them will quake before us. Because freedom and justice are the strongest forces on earth.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Let's start with something you do a lot of at the college, Larry Arnn. You produce a lot of high school teachers. Many of them are employed here in Phoenix by Great Hearts and other charter schools. And you produce a lot for your own charter schools, and I think this is a very important mission of the college. What do you think about that part of your mission?
Well, of course, it's precious to me because the most important young academic in America today, Kathleen Arnn O'Toole, is the head of one of our charter schools in Austin, Texas. We have 8 charter schools now, and we're opening 4 more in August, and the goal is 50. Right now, there's about 4,000 students going to them. Everybody learns Latin. Everybody wears uniforms. Everybody signs an honor code. There's one operating in Savannah, Georgia, in the inner city school building where Clarence Thomas went to school for 2 years. And the strategy, Hillsdale College has a 2-part strategy. Your presence here is a sign that we've done pretty well, and it's always against the odds. We're not as rich as the richest, and we don't have the federal government to pay our need-based aid. But the point is, we're trying to make it, and I invite, by the way, every single one of you to come and visit. Come in September and October if you're whining about the weather. And I will pick a week when I'm in town. They're known far in advance. And I go and eat in the dining hall every day that I'm on campus, and I sit with the students, and I'll take you with me. And you can see what happens. It's glorious. I tell you, it's just very beautiful. Now, our job is to make that as perfect as humanly it can be. And then the second part of the job is to make that radiate everywhere. That's why this night. That's why online courses, which, by the way, I learned 2 days ago, have now passed 1 million registrations. And that's why Imprimis, and that's why these charter schools. And the why can be summarized simply. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, toward the end of their lives, wrote some letters back and forth about how to preserve the republic. And they didn't say what you'd think, I wrote the Constitution, we should read that. I wrote the Declaration of Independence, no, we should read that. We should follow the precepts of my presidential administration, no, mine, right? That, by the way, that reminds you of anybody in politics today? They said, no. We have to teach people to understand the fundamental expressions that are used in the making of America. And so these 3 kids I met tonight who are coming to Hillsdale College, you're going to learn what is meant by the expression of the laws of nature and of nature's God. And you're going to be able to explain those laws against intelligent opposition, which we are going to provide to you. And that is the way to fix the heart and mind of the country. That's why that's important.
Second question. By the way, I was at, Larry's invited me to the college occasionally. He invites me in January, and he invited me to Arizona when it was raining. Estimate of where I am in Larry. He invited you to come in the fall, I come in January.
If he stops whining about the weather, I'll let him come in the fall.
But when I came in January, a young intern who'd worked for me for the summer sat down and asked him a trick question about Hegel. So I actually saw this, and I saw the track team become involved in a conversation about Hegel and whether or not Hegel thought the perfect state involved coercion or some such thing. I can't remember what it was. And it wasn't unusual. That is, in fact, usual. And it's actually pleasant as well.
Well, you have to understand about a college. Nobody knows what a college is anymore. First of all, the word college means partnership. It's something a bunch of people do together. Now, that means they have to agree on the purpose. That means not diversity. The word university, which is almost as old as the word college, that means many things turning around one thing. Whereas the word diversity, they're cognate, they're both from Latin, that means many things turning around more than one thing, right? So if you ever hear anybody say, and you will, that the purpose of University X is diversity, you can mark that person down for illiterate. So it's just true. But so once you agree on what you're going to get done, like we want to understand the best things there are to understand, and they are naturally interesting to everyone. Everybody wants to know. You know, like say to somebody, what is God? Well, the first thing they'll do is they'll dismiss that as an idea that's just whatever anybody thinks, right? And then when you introduce them to the fact that if that's true, that means that there isn't any God, they've taken a position now, see? Then all of a sudden you're thinking about it. And theology is your subject. People love that. So once you agree that's what you're going to do, then the question is, what's the truth of it? There's where the diversity part comes in, because academic institutions proceed by evidence and argument and proof. And that means at Hillsdale College, everything is an argument. And it has to be. And you know, when you're one of the teachers, when the student says something, the more true it is, the more you have to disagree with it.
Now I want to return to Mike Lee and the conversation I had. He said when I brought you up that you were a mentor of his. I hope not in the Department of Socks, but not going to win re-election if that's the case. But what is this Kirby Center? Why are you doing it? Why have you planted your flag on Capitol Hill? Why should this audience know about that?
Well, thank you. So Mike Lee is a friend of mine. My wife and I, we don't own a house in Hillsdale. We're tenants of the college. And so we bought a little house close to the Kirby Center in Capitol Hill. And we bought it so that I didn't have to stay in hotels on Capitol Hill all the time, which are, if you're like me, you're gone a lot, and you get tired of that. But also we bought it so we could have people over for dinner. Who? Mike Lee. Anybody? And see, our lobbying efforts are confined to people who are really smart and willing to learn. And I don't care how powerful they are. Lee happens to be very powerful, and Cotton is becoming powerful. But why is that? Those guys friends of mine? They're just delightful people, and they learn a lot. So in that correspondence between Madison and Jefferson, they're talking in particular, they're talking generally what a citizen needs to know, but they're talking in particular what a statesman needs to know. And they don't know these things these days. I mean, one of the presidential candidates, he called me the other day, and I was on the phone with him for 30 minutes, and it was I'm not going to tell you his name. It would surprise you. It's a prominent one. And it was a very gratifying call, and I didn't expect it to be. And he said, I thought he was going to say, you know, I'm really a conservative, and you should help me, because I have some credentials in that world. And it wasn't anything like that. He said, you know, I watched one of your courses the other day. That was great. I said, thank you. He said, I have a suggestion. You should do an online course for prospective citizens. I said, that's a great idea. So we're working on it, and when we do it, you'll find out that person's name. And then he said, I think there's something you know a lot about. He said, describe to me American values. And I said, well, they didn't use that term, you know. That's a term from modern social science. And it places the emphasis on what you think. And by the way, all you freshmen to be next year, don't come and tell me your opinion about anything. I don't give a crap about that. Right? Sometimes in these meetings, somebody will say, if I come to Hillsdale, will you respect my opinion? And I would say, yeah, we don't care about that. What we want to know is, what do you claim is the truth, right? And then we can answer the claim and make our own claim, right? Then we can all learn. We don't like answers, one of them tonight from one of the young women who's coming next year. We don't like the answers that begin, well, to me, you know, so I always say, I stop and say, what do I care about that? You know? So the point is, values, that's what it means. I said, they talked about principles. And then they talked about character, which is the thing, that word comes from a Greek word that means to etch or engrave, the thing in us that makes us. So when Hound Dog over here, Behemoth, Bull Mastiff, goes to the Oakland Raiders, what do they say? What does the coach of the Arizona Cardinals say about him? And see, I know him better than they do. I've watched him grow up. They say, boy, that guy, he's very motivated. He's very careful. He has real integrity. In other words, they're saying, Jared Valdir has an excellent character. He won't lie to you. If he makes a commitment, he'll keep it. That's what character means, see. What's the American character? I explained it on the phone. It took 3 minutes. He said, gosh, that was beautiful. He said, did you make that up? And I said, sir, if you want to hear a great symphony, you don't have to write one. Somebody already did that. And he said, but you carry that around with you. And I said, yes, I do. Many at the college do. And he said, I think that's wonderful. Now, you see, that is the specific kind of thing that man needs to know. And it will change the world if they know that. That's why Tom Cotton is like what he is. It's by the way, it's always two things. When I say to you young ones who are coming next year, you have to be both willing and able, I'm making a statement about your intellect and your character. Because you have to give yourself to it. So Tom has a really excellent character. He's a remarkable man. Gosh, he's quiet, son of a gun, but he's very bold. That stuff he did last week, that was crazy and great. But also, he knows because he thinks. Hugh and I have been friends all these years because every time we have a conversation, we're interested in the same stuff, and forever.
Which brings me to this. We are, if not on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the deliverance of Lincoln's second inaugural, we are close to it. Why is that a great speech?
Well, you have to put the first and the second inaugurals together. Do you know the speeches? Go home and read them tonight. By the way, it's like reading poetry. Do you know what the Peoria speech is? It's 1858, I think. Lincoln went away and put together the history of slavery and the Union and gave it at Peoria. And I was reading it in my study once 10 years ago because a friend of mine published a book about it. I hadn't read it in 25 years. And my wife walked in the study and she said, hi, and I said hi, and then she said, are you crying? And I said, a little bit. She said, why? And I said, dear, it's really crazy to say, but I'm reading the Peoria speech. And I just tell you, it's so generous and so wise and so great. And it's not as good as the first and second inaugural. The first inaugural is a legal appeal about the nature of the Union, and it ends with a poem. The legal argument is, first of all, two people make a contract, one can't break it. That's secession, right? And you can't be a strict constructionist and say that only the words of the Constitution are sovereign, and then be a secessionist because those words happen not to be in there. And so he lays that out, and then he says, and remember the physical fact that we cannot separate. Physically, we can't. And if we break into two countries, your slaves are still going to run across the border because they want to get away. And that's going to be a worse problem than it is now. And then he ends by saying, I am loath to close the hearth fires of our land and the graves of the patriots we share in common, right? So that's that one. Now, the second inaugural is short, and the second inaugural is an explanation of the failure of the appeal in the first inaugural. And it's religious poem. He says, I don't have a lot to say. He says, it looks like the war is going to go okay. He says, the war is a judgment on us. And see, remember the duty of anybody, anyway. Like, I know some things, and because of that, they own me. I must do what they say. I've given my commitment to them. I carry them in my heart. Everybody I work with is just like that. It's a very beautiful thing. Hugh and I are friends because of that. Right? So, we Americans are like that because we have a birthday and a document that gives the reasons for what we are. And it commands us to do things that are very difficult. And we often fail. And when we fail grandly, we have to pay for it. So that's what Lincoln says. He says, if every drop of blood drawn by the lash during 200 years of the bondsman's unrequited toil must now be repaid with another drawn by the sword, still it will be said that the ways of the Lord are righteous altogether. It is strange that some men should pray to a just God to wring their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. Woe to the world because of offenses, and woe, but if offenses must needs come, woe to him by whom it cometh. Now, a farmer, uneducated, from the frontier, wrote those words and saved this union. Wrote them himself. It's one of the most beautiful things that ever happened. And the point to remember when it looks desperate is if that can happen, any good thing can happen and likely will.
I have the advantage of having interviewed Larry a few times and having been in his seminars, so I know his best stuff. It's like when I am out with Prager, who's a very bad man, and I usually get him to tell his best story, but there's a bit of Churchill's life that Larry talks about that I think is useful at this time in the context of Iran. And it is that he participated in the last cavalry charge of the British Empire. But in so doing, learned a lesson about where we were going that Larry explicates, and I think is useful for people to hear again and again and again. I never tire, actually, of hearing it. I probably heard it 6 or 7 times. But would you give them the setup and the lesson and its applicability?
Winston Churchill, who was 5 foot 7.5 tall, was a very great man. He was like Lincoln. And remember what they're like. Like, I can tell you stories about the greatest of the statesmen, and they're rare, but when you hear the story, it makes you want to cry, because it's beautiful. It's a blessing to know it. Makes you better. So Churchill did many things like that, by the way, but this particular one he did when he was young, and you mean about war being dangerous and all that. So Churchill was born the eldest son of the junior son of a duke. And that's the highest of the peerages. And the duke was not rich. And so you can get from a duke or any nobleman in England, you can get 3 things. You can get title, and you can get money, and you can get connections. And Churchill only got one of those. And the connections were somewhat mixed. But he's this guy, and by the time he was 26 years old, he had fought in 3 wars. He had written best-selling books, about 2 of them. He had made himself the most highly paid and widely read political journalist in the country. And then he got elected to Parliament. And also he'd written a novel. He was very energetic. And in 1898, in the Sudan, the first Islamic republic was founded by a man named the Mahdi of Allah, his grandson runs Sudan today, and his grandson and his grandnephew are the teachers of Osama bin Laden. Winston Churchill fought against him. And they go down there, the British, this Mahdiya, the movement of the Mahdi, grew up in the desert among these radical Islamics, and they formed themselves into a desert force, and they besieged Khartoum, which is down the Nile 1,000 miles from Cairo, and they took the city, which was part of the British Empire, and they beheaded a British hero by the name of Charles or Chinese Gordon, a colorful, he fought a lot of battles in China. And they beheaded him in public. And the British sent a camel corps down there to try to relieve him, and they chopped it up, this camel corps. And it's 1,000 miles down there, and much of the Nile is impassable. A long passage in the middle, 200 or 300 miles, you can't take a boat down there. So you can't get stuff down there like a modern army gets. And so a guy who became very consequential in Churchill's life was appointed commander, and what he did was put a bunch of equipment on gunboats and float them down to the place where you couldn't move anymore down the Nile, and then he built a railway around the shallow place, and then he put all the equipment on there, gunboats included, and artillery, and men, and regiments, and he took them by train, and he put them back in the river. And he went down to Khartoum, and now there's a modern army down there. And Churchill, because he'd been a best-selling author, got to meet all the famous people who knew his name anyway, and so he sits with the Prime Minister one day, and he sits with the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, in the same week. And they both said, because they want him to tell them about his fighting in Afghanistan, where he fought before he fought in the Sudan. And his book called The Melican Field Force is a bestseller and really great. It's very worth reading. And then when the interview's over, he says, they say to him, well, young man, what can we do to help you? And he says to both of them, to the Prime Minister and the heir to the throne, I want to go down and fight in the Sudan. There's a force going down there. And in these days, the British Army is very officer-heavy, so it can expand if there's a big war. And all the officers are besieging everybody in authority to get to go, right? And so the heir to the throne and the Prime Minister ask the commander if he will please take Churchill, and he refuses them, and so Churchill went anyway. And off he went. And so he gets down there and he sees the battle, and one part of the battle was this cavalry charge. But another part of the battle was 35,000 dervishes charged, 70,000 dervishes. They were called dervish, whirling dervishes, like the dust things in the desert. These Arab militant Muslim warriors charged 25,000 British. And there's a paragraph in the book called The River War, which I encourage you to read. And young Winston Churchill, who is explicitly there to become famous and get elected to Parliament, he says that all the time to people, he writes the best-selling book, The River War, about this. And it's a very popular war because everybody loved Gordon, and these guys are crazy, just like the ones we know today. It's what they were like. And when he writes the story of that battle, I can remember reading it 30 years ago, and I can remember being arrested by it. I went, wow, look how he sees this. Because here's what happened. They charged across the desert, and they were simply destroyed. And the one that got the closest to the British came within 150 yards. And the British lost less than a dozen people, and the Arabs took 5,000 dead. And it was because of mechanized warfare. And Churchill describes it in one paragraph. He describes it in a chapter. The chapter is called The Battle of Omdurman. He says, the white flags, the leading cavalry of the dervishes, came over the hill, and they did not understand the tragedy that impended them. because the ranges were known and the artillery was ready. And then he starts describing the charge, and he describes it in the first half of the paragraph from the dervish side. He says the dust and the sweat and the screaming and the blood and the whistling of metal through the ranks. And then he cuts in the middle of the paragraph to the British side, and he says, the infantry fired steadily and stolidly, for they were interested in the work. But eventually it became tedious. You could hardly see the dervishes over the sight, but you could tell that successively there were fewer of them. And then the men had to bring more ammunition, and others to bring water jackets to cool the barrels so they didn't melt. So you see, he's describing a factory. And that means that, by the way, all this technology we've got, Churchill figured this out, see, because he was a genius, just like Lincoln. Such men, Coolidge, remember, he said, great statesmen are the ambassadors of Providence sent to reveal to us our unknown selves. And that means, by the way, if you can find out who they are, and I can tell you, and you can read them, you can know wonderful things that they figured out, they could see. So Churchill said, look, we've got all this power now. What are we going to do with it? In 1925, he writes, mankind has never been in this position before. Without improving appreciably in virtue or enjoying wiser guidance, he has got into his hands at last the means of his own destruction. Then he sees, by the way, he sees the coming of this kind of scientific administrative government that eats half the economy of the United States now. And he says to it, he says, what are they going to do, you see? Eventually, they will manufacture us. He writes this in 1931. By the way, did you know that the family is collapsing worldwide, including in the Muslim countries? And all over America? And we're not going to have babies, right? And then we can make them. And then once we start making them, can't we just make them to do whatever we want? They can be our servants. Just like in Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Churchill wrote that before Huxley did. You see? So Churchill understands the terror of the modern age. And we have to understand it. But let me tell you, since that's very gloomy, right? Isn't it? In 1925, that essay is called Shall We All Commit Suicide? Do you know Winston Churchill wrote such a thing? 15 years before, he said, I will say to you, as I have said to my colleagues in the cabinet, I have nothing to offer you but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. That guy was afraid of war. That's why Tom Cotton is right, by the way. Get ready. And if you have to fight it, win it fast.
Now, our time grows short, but I have a method to my madness. We began with the founding, we moved to Lincoln, we went to Churchill, and now I'm going to ask for help. As I said at the beginning, I get to ask some questions of the GOP presidential candidates in the fall. So last week I was at Stanford, and I was in the presence of a very great American, Condoleezza Rice, a child of Birmingham or Bombingham, who remembers Selma quite vividly, who remembers the explosion that killed the 4 little girls in Birmingham because it occurred 3 blocks from her father's church. She's a very great American. And I asked her, and I'm asking a lot of people, what are appropriate questions to ask Republican presidential candidates if you wish to find among them a Lincoln or a Churchill, not in their biography, but in their capacity to make prudential judgments? And I asked her, would it be a fair question to ask, are we safer from the threat of a mass casualty attack of the sort that 9/11 was today than we were 6.5 years ago? She thought that was a very fair question. It might separate candidates. So now I ask you, Dr. Arnn, what is a good question to ask candidates to find the Lincolns and the Churchills on the stage?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I would, if I were asking the question, so you asked questions, I'll tell you what to ask some of them. I would ask them for examples of things that the government may not do.
Making notes here.
By the way, I'd give them a few. Like, did you know that at Hillsdale College, we now live under our first federal government regulations, and the Department of Education. And it started in the Bush years when they have basically given the Department of Education control of the private accrediting agencies. And so this week, and I remind you that I have a really great job and I get to do splendid things all the time. But this week, I'm answering an email from the provost of the college, David Whalen, one of the best people I know, because we're setting up our student complaint system, because we're required to have one. And we're required to make a judgment whether a complaint from a student is a major complaint, and we're required to record the major complaints, and we're required to look at the complaints from time to time and initial them. We're not required to do anything about them, but we are required to look at them and have them available when they come they're coming in 3 years, to accredit us. Now, that's not stupid, that's dog stupid. And I'll tell you the reason. If you can get in, there are 2,700 four-year colleges in America. And if you can get into Hillsdale College, you can get into at least 2,650 of them. And that means that, and you know, as I've told you, our particular expertise is torturing the young. And if they don't like it, they can go somewhere else. And they will. And that means that we have powerful reasons to pay the closest attention to what they think and do and their success, whereas the people in the Department of Education will never know their names, right? And so why should I read that idiocy or spend any time on it? But I spend now 30 or 40% of my time on compliance issues. Now, we don't get a nickel from them. And you go read about the Battle of Gettysburg and ask yourself, would the history of the country would be different if we didn't exist? And so we are a benefit to the nation, and its government punishes us. And if you read Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, there is no power, not just not to do that, there's no power to do anything like that in regard to anyone. That is not how it's supposed to work. So ask them what they cannot do.
It's a great question, Alvin. Now, it's 8:15 and my schedule says closing remarks, so I'm going to make mine and then I'm going to let Dr. Arnn. I only have two. The first begins with a question. Jared, how long is your contract for? 5 years? Joe Thomas will be retiring. Right? Condoleezza Rice is a Cleveland Browns fan. I want you to know that. Just wait a minute. Part one of my closing remark. My second closing remark is that all of you can help Hillsdale in its mission. It's an important mission. You can help it with donations, but more importantly, you can help it by telling your friends about Imprimis, about telling your friends about the online courses, and about telling young people of promise, no matter where they live in this country, that they ought to give it a serious look if they aspire to excellence. They may not go there, they may go there, but at least get them to look if they wish to aspire to excellence, because it's a lantern in the north and we need more of them and we need more of their graduates. And so thank you for being here tonight and for supporting this college in the way that I just love to support it. Dr. Arnn, your closing comments.
So I will tell you that I've been TiVoing Jared's games for, this is your fourth year? Fifth year. Wow, he's getting old.
Veteran.
He's getting old. And it's got to the place now, and I scan through the games and watch him block, and it's got to the place where it's boring now. Nobody ever gets around him. but I invite you to do that. I think Hugh is a sign of something to me, his what kind of guy he is and all that. And that he's part of my last point, and you're part of it too. It's actually true that we're in as bad a shape as we have been in. We may lose our republic, right? But we won't. And the reason is we are going to stop it. And the reason we can, this is a point from Churchill. In those gloomy things that I told you that he wrote, he makes this point. He, in an essay called Mass Effects in Modern Life, and in another essay called 50 Years Hence, they were written about the same time. He says, if you look at the kind of government that's prospering in the world, and ours is becoming like this, right? Because what they're doing, right, they want to get your education for you. They want to raise your children for you. They want to make your living for you. And then what is there for you to do? Except comply, right? And Churchill says that kind of government has been taken to its ultimate perfection by the Bolsheviks, he said, which, by the way, really only implements all of the social principles that are found in the society of the white ant. Not like the bee, they can produce no honey. He says, like an ant, like a termite, see? And then he says, but human nature is more intractable than ant nature. It is at once the glory and the safeguard of mankind that it is easy to lead and hard to drive. See, by the way, that's the first principle of management. So now, Jared's coach, I hear him talk about Jared, and I think he understands that. He can't make them do it. They do it. It comes from them. He helps them do it. He leads them to do it. In 50 Years Hence, Churchill writes, we make all this material progress, he said. Imagine in 16 or 17 generations, a people who have pleasures way beyond any we know, who can live as long as they want, who can go anywhere interplanetary they want to go. What is the good of all that? How does that draw us any near the questions that we so want to answer? Why are we here, and what is our life for? And the fact that we long for the answer to those questions mean that we are not made to be governed against our will. So you see, the good news about all this force and power that's assembled now to cow the American people, the good news is, in the end, it won't work. It's vulnerable. And so we have to have the wisdom to understand that, and we have to have the courage to fight it. Thanks.
Thank you and good night.